Russian economy is increasingly vulnerable. Yeah, I mean, it's been very durable for almost 3-4 years of the war, but there are just signs that wheels are, could well be coming off, and it's a great time, I think, now for the West to push on with its advantage and tighten sanctions, focus on secondary sanctions. Again, that reduction in the oil price cap was pretty significant, and I think, in response to the India Putin meeting and the Indian suggestion or Modi's suggestion that they want to buy energy long term. Again, I think the West should signal that that's a mistake from the Modi administration and that its companies in India are at risk of secondary sanctions. Obviously, there's been frustration around the peace process. Putin doesn't seem very serious about it. Looks like he's playing for a long war. We need to increase the costs to Putin of that war, both in terms of increasing military supplies to the Ukrainians, so increase the cost on the battlefield to Russia, but at the same time, tighten the screws around the Russian economy, right? I mean, this year, inflation is high. The Russian economy is close to recession, very little growth. As I mentioned, export revenues from oil and commodities are reducing. That puts pressure on the balance of payments and also on the fiscal position. So, we need to, Putin says it. He thinks he's at war with us, right? We need to take advantage of the vulnerabilities as they present themselves from him. And we need to, double up on sanctions and secondary sanctions, etc.
And of course, Ukraine are pushing ahead, as you say, as you'd expect them to. I mean, we've seen strikes this week on sort of shadow fleet and sanctioned Russian-operated vessels in the Black Sea. How much damage can Ukraine inflict doing these direct strikes that are now expanding not just on refineries and export ports, but to the ships themselves?
Yeah, well, those you mentioned the attack, they were quite interesting for a number of reasons. I mean, I guess one, the capability that Ukraine proved able with naval drones in particular to hit Russia-related vessels or shadow fleet vessels at long range. But actually, two kind of interesting features. One is some of the ships were hitting in Turkey's economic zone. Turkey wasn't too happy with that, actually, and also the other one was the Ukrainians hit one of the three moorings of the CPC, the Caspian Pipeline Consortium pipeline that comes into Novorossiysk. So this is Kazakh exports through Russia, and they hit one of the three moorings. Right now, again, the Kazakhs weren't very happy. Now, and Ukraine has been fairly careful with countries that are either neutral or fairly supportive to limit the damage to those countries. I mean, I sense in a way that the Ukrainians were unhappy here with the Witkoff peace process in Moscow. I think they wanted to signal to the broader community, particularly the Americans, that Ukraine has the ability to hit global energy infrastructure and have global market impact if negotiations aren't going their way. I mean, that they have agency. I mean, a lot's been made, I guess, in recent weeks about this Witkoff process, and that he ends up with Kushner going to Moscow and the Ukrainians are kind of excluded. I think the message there to everyone was, look, Ukraine can't be excluded, right? We're not a captive kind of audience or captive kind of player, right? I mean, we have long-range strike capability. We know the vulnerabilities of Russia. We know the vulnerabilities of energy supply chains. If you're going to force a deal on us, there are things we can do also to change the global narrative. Like, we need to be listened to. So I wouldn't expect, I think the Ukrainians going forward will be more careful in terms of what they hit. I don't think, for example, they're going to take the second and third moorings out on the CPC. I mean, remember, this is, not Russian oil, it's Kazakh oil that has been exported to European markets. I mean, actually, Ukraine and Europe, we should want that. We should want more diversification away from Russia. I mean, but I think this was all about signaling from the Ukrainians, etc.
And you mentioned before about the challenging position that the Russian economy has ended up in, and some of the signals of that happening. How should we interpret the selling off of gold reserves that is going on at the moment? Is it a sign that sanctions are working? Just that struggling of the Russian economy? What is going on there?
Well, probably, what is clear, we've seen a really significant drop in oil and energy export receipts for Russia, right? Significantly. It's, running around half the level it was a year or so ago, right? So, that does mean that, the fiscal, the balance of payments trade position and is weaker. Probably they're struggling in terms of reserve accumulation. Remember here that, the less they earn in export receipts, the less they can use to buy imports. And they need to buy stuff, right? I mean, they need to buy military tech, inputs for military tech. I mean, sustaining this war machine is really, really expensive, right? And we have an interest now, in Europe. I mean, we can debate how the Americans view the threat from Russia. I think it's absolutely crystal clear now that Europe views Russia now as an existential threat. We have an interest in making sure that Russia receives less export revenues to be used to fuel imports, to buy stuff that need to regenerate that military capability. Now, if they are selling at gold reserves, that means there are pressure points, right? It means that they are short of foreign currency and they need to generate some revenue to continue some of those purchases.
And speaking of foreign currency, there have been some sort of parallels drawn between this being done and Russia's need for Chinese yuan currency. What's the situation there? Does Russia have enough to keep buying things from China that it needs to carry on with its?
Well, needs must, and I think Russia will. It's guns versus butter story, right? I mean, in the end, they'll conserve, the non-essential goods, and they'll buy the military stuff. But there is a cost and a price for that, right? I mean, it just means that ordinary Russians will increasingly begin to feel the cost of this war, right? I mean, you mentioned earlier, some of the deep strikes by the Ukrainians, particularly in terms of refineries, and how that is tightening the noose around Russia. I mean, this is all about bringing the war home to ordinary Russians, making them understand that a cost and a price is being paid by themselves, right? I mean, we're seeing disruptions to petrol supplies, higher petrol prices, queues, all those kind of things because of those hits by Ukraine on their energy infrastructure. And again, things are only going to get more difficult the longer the war goes on. I mean, I think Putin likes to portray this image that, there's all this durability and they can survive a long war. Well, so far there was a lot of insulation or buffers built into the Russian economy. I've spoken about this a lot. Putin knew that what was going to happen, built foreign exchange reserves to record highs. Yes, we immobilized half of those reserves, but they still had over 300 billion. That goes a long way. They benefited in the short term because of the spike in energy prices. That helped them in terms of the current account and trade positions, went into surplus, allowed them to fund the war. Now things are getting more difficult. They're drawing down their foreign currency reserves. They're running much smaller trade surpluses and current account surpluses. And again, it means that ultimately hard decisions will have to be taken and life will get more difficult for ordinary Russians, I would imagine. And eventually I think that will weigh on Putin. And again, we have an ability to make life much more difficult. We need to be more ambitious in what we're doing around the sanctions piece. Obviously, a lot of focus this week on the immobilized Russian asset issue. Again, take the money away from Russia, give it to Ukraine, enable it to sustain its war effort for longer and help it buy equipment to defend itself and ourselves.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, or you can also sign up for a membership where you'll get exclusive content and access to videos earlier than you would otherwise. And remember, for the latest news and analysis, you can read The Times at thetimes.com, or you can listen to Times Radio. And if you want to hear more from Frontline, you can also hear us in podcast form. Just look for Times Radio's Frontline wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks very much. Goodbye.